Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're gonna be reacting to
Could the Ukraine crisis create a federal EU?
This video was brought to you by Henson Shaving. Earlier this week, the EU's 27 commissioners began negotiating the EU's next budget. This is always a contentious process, but it's proving especially difficult this time round because the EU needs to decide how it's going to pay back the 300 billion euros it's spent so far via the COVID Recovery Fund, which was funded by bonds issued by the European Union itself rather than the individual member states. So in this video, we're going to explain why this is such a difficult problem for the EU, why it could pave the way for an EU tax, especially if the EU issues more joint debt to support Ukraine without the US in the
Wow, so the tax is already high in Europe, in European countries. They want to add an EU tax on top of the country tax. People, whoosh.
future, and why history suggests that this would put the EU on a path towards a more federal structure, like in the US.
Would be
I mean,
United
yeah.
States of Europe.
yeah.
I
I
mean,
can see that happening.
I've been preaching that honestly for a minute now. It makes sense to me. People have in the comments had some solid counter arguments. Number one being language difference. Every country has a different language, basically, almost. Almost every country. Whereas here in the States, there is no official language, but you
There's
can.
language differences here too.
No, but you can get by with English in every single state.
Yeah.
There, not necessarily. So that's a strong argument against it. I didn't think of it before. So I saw that comment, I was like, okay, that's a good one. But let's see.
We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and currently
Wow,
72% of you haven't yet
congratulations.
subscribed. So
Are we
let us a
subscribed?
hand and subscribe
Yes,
to
we
it.
are.
So
How
let's
many
start by
have
explaining
now?
what actually
This is
happened
in the
with
video?
EU's
Yeah,
COVID
today,
recovery.
8 hours ago.
Today, the EU is mostly funded by
Everyone's not
financial
they meet the
contributions from
million
its member
yet.
states, with the biggest and wealthiest countries contributing the most. When the pandemic struck, however, member states needed urgent financial support, but the EU didn't really have enough spare cash to help, and it couldn't ask member states for more contributions. After unsuccessfully trying a whole load of other things, including support from the European Central Bank and reviving the European Stability Mechanism, the instrument used for the Eurozone bailouts, in May 2020, the EU announced that it will be providing up to 650 billion euros in grants and loans that will be funded by joint borrowing at the EU level. In other words, the EU announced that it, not member states, would borrow the 650 billion euros on international markets, and then disperse that money to countries struggling with the pandemic. The program was called Next Generation EU, and the instrument that actually borrowed the money was called the Recovery and Resilience Facility, or RRF. Now, it's hard to stress how unprecedented all of this was. While the EU has engaged in some joint borrowing in the past, the European Investment Bank and ESM, for instance, can both borrow money on international markets. The sums involved were always way smaller, and there was always a clear sense of how the debt would actually be paid back. With the RRF, though, not only are the sums involved pretty massive, over 300 billion euros has been dispersed already, but there wasn't a clear sense of how this would all be paid back, especially the 359
Was there a
billion
plan
euros
initially? Or
No.
they just
They just, saw the
Like,
shit is going down. We're like, we gotta
yeah.
do something. Let's do it now.
Yeah.
Figure it out later.
later?
Now is later.
Oh.
worth of grants. And for context, the
hate
EU's
when later
entire
comes.
annual budget for
I know, right?
2025 is less than 200 billion euros. Anyway, the EU is due to start paying these off in 2028, which is why it's the big issue in the ongoing budget negotiations for the EU's next spending period, running from 2028 to 2034. Originally, the Commission proposed using tariffs, levies on carbon emissions, and a new tax on the profits of multinationals, which could all be levied by the EU. But this didn't work, largely because member states have decided that they want the proceeds of these taxes to go into their national coffers instead. The next option was to pay
To
it
the
off by increasing
national-
member contributions.
Coffins?
What's that?
I don't know. I guess to their national banks, not EU bank, but to
Oh.
their national pockets.
By about 15%.
Oh, pockets.
Pockets.
Yeah, pockets.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this would be politically controversial and perhaps unfeasible if the EU engages in further joint borrowing before 2028, which looks increasingly likely. Mario Draghi's celebrated EU competitiveness report, for instance, called for further joint borrowing to fund investments in productivity and renewable energy, which will become increasingly tempting if a Trump trade war puts even more strain on the European economy. But perhaps more pressingly, the fact that Europe will probably have to guarantee Ukraine's security without America could well push the EU to more joint borrowing. Trump has already made it clear that he wants to end the war in Ukraine, and that the US will play no role in guaranteeing Ukraine's security afterwards. This puts all of the responsibility on the EU, but it'll be expensive. Zelensky, for instance, claims that an effective European peacekeeping force would require at least 100,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine, only slightly smaller than the current size of the entire UK armed forces. And Bloomberg Economics estimates that it would cost an astonishing €3 trillion over 10 years, including the cost of bolstering Europe's national militaries. This represents an eye-watering 15% of Europe's GDP, and will put an utterly enormous strain on national budgets that could be
Seems like EU's gonna be in the same position like the States. Just run up the deficit. Just keep running that bitch up. And then somebody, the next, commissioner or whatever they called, European Prime Minister, gonna be his or her problem.
further exacerbated if Trump puts recession-inducing tariffs on the EU. This would make the idea of further joint borrowing way more attractive.
Why would he put tariffs on the EU?
He said he was reciprocating. Like, if you put tariffs on us, we'll put it on back
No,
on
but
you.
like the Mexico, he wanted to put tariffs because they want Mexico to take in the, deportees. China, I don't know. He just has beef with China. Canada, honestly, I have no idea. But EU, I don't know. He has like any. I haven't heard him mentioning tariffs on EU, to be honest.
Especially
He's
because
ally. Remember hearing him say, if you put it on us, we'll put the same back on you.
that I remember. But EU, I don't think they're gonna put tariffs on American goods.
EU could currently borrow at lower rates than most member states can.
Wix. One platform.
Wix.
Any website. Unlimited creation.
So if there is further joint borrowing, how will the EU actually pay it back? Well, if they can't force massive increases in member state contributions, the EU might resort to a direct tax. Now, this might sound ridiculously unlikely, given the widespread antipathy towards the EU at the moment, but it's not impossible.
Antipathy, wow.
Paradoxically, the EU skeptic sentiment might encourage member states to endorse an EU tax, because they could then blame it on Brussels. But more importantly, letting the EU tax directly would immediately bring down EU borrowing costs, which are currently slightly higher than those of Germany, because investors will be more confident of the EU's tax-raising abilities. Similar dynamics drove the widespread adoption of the euro at the end of the 20th century. While it's
I mean, I can. It's a little hypocritical, but I see it. Like they got the money from EU countries. Now they're like, oh no, I don't want to pay it back, and money goes straight to you. So I get it from like, but at the same time, you already took the money. You gotta, help pay it back now. So it's, I guess the logic is, the logic I guess would be, oh, it's the previous government took the money, not me. So, I don't know.
Single currency seemed pretty much inconceivable as late as the 80s, when countries realised that merely stating their intention to join the euro brought their borrowing costs down, because markets assumed that euro countries would have to meet stringent fiscal criteria and enjoy the support of the European Central Bank. They were quick to sign up. Similarly, if member states realize
it's like you take the benefits, but when it's time to pay up for those benefits, no one wants to show up.
EU the power of taxation, which currently lies exclusively with the member states, can ease debt burdens, they might be tempted, especially if they have to borrow trillions for Ukraine. This would also fit a long-running historical pattern. Crisis forces some central authority to act as a borrower of last resort, and then in the process of repaying the debts, breeds deeper political union, because taxpayers want more influence in how their money is spent. This is what happened in America and Germany, both federal systems that evolved out of confederations of independent states. At America's founding in 1776, the federal government, then the Continental Congress, had no powers of taxation, and, like in the EU today, relied entirely on contributions from member states. Americans just didn't like the idea of a strong central government, but during the War of Independence, the Continental Congress had to step in as a borrower of last resort to fund the war effort, and then had to assume tax-raising powers to pay off these debts, paving the way for a political union. Similarly, before the First World War,
I didn't know that's why the union formed. I mean, I'm sure I learned back in high school, but I don't
But putting
remember.
it all together.
Germany was a patchwork
Similar situation
Yeah.
to what Europe is going through.
of at least semi-independent states, and the Reich, essentially the federal government, had limited tax-raising powers, mostly involving tariffs. The First World War forced the Reich to step in as the borrower of last resort, and then assume the power of direct taxation in the interwar years. Now, to stress, we're not saying that this is definitely going to happen. Rather, the point we're trying to make is that the EU's decision to step in as the borrower of last resort follows a well-worn historical pattern that usually ends with deeper political union. To some extent, this is how the EU has always worked. Successive crises have pushed it, step by step, towards the ever-closer union originally envisaged by the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which first established the EEC. Lots of people actively
Yeah, I've
The way he answered this
he's just spread into the commercial. I wouldn't mind EU becoming as I've been saying this, I think it should become the United States of Europe. Why not?
Yeah.
Well, not that it should become. I was just always saying, whenever we compare United States of America, we should compare to European Union, not to any individual country in Europe, because
Yeah.
it's just not fair. The countries are too small.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, I can see the pros and cons of both.
I can see how they also want to maintain their own identity. They don't want to now have their own state country problems become now a group problem, a group like country area
Yeah,
problem.
I get it. There's gonna be a lot of pushback for sure. There's gonna be
Mhm.
certain countries might succeed from the union if that was to happen.
Yeah, like us here too in the States.
I can see that, but I do think some countries would be okay with that. Interesting.
Is everyone like redrawing like their allies? That's what I feel like.
Well, like what for war allies? I don't think this is like.
No, overall, like who's gonna be a part of this team? Like who to work
I don't
forward
know.
with?
I understand, but
Mm.
interesting stuff is happening.
Yeah.
Um,
Guys, of course, let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Join the Discord. And as always, share as much kindness as